Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be talking about how and why I read as much as I do. So, I read quite a lot of books. There are definitely people on BookTube and in the world who read a lot more than me, but in general I do read quite a lot. I would say that I read on average maybe between 10 and 14 books a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, and I usually read sort of 120 plus books a year. In 2023 I read 167 books, and I often get asked on this channel, you know, how do you manage to read as much as you do? How do you manage to read a lot of books? I made a very similar video to this back in 2019, but you know, that was 5 years ago. My life has changed quite a lot. My reading habits have changed quite a lot. So I thought I'd make a kind of updated one. This video is going to be more of like an explanation of how and why I read a lot, more than like tips for reading more, because some of these things are quite like specific to me personally and to my life, and reading is very varied from person to person. You know, no one has to read a ton of books. I'm also going to link down below to a video made by Olivia Savannah from Olivia's Catastrophe a couple of months ago, called something like How to Read More and Why You Shouldn't, where she also talks about, like, you know, not getting too hung up on reading so much that you end up burning out and kind of like not enjoying your reading for what it is. So I'd really recommend that video too, and I do think it's important when thinking about, okay, so maybe you want to read more, but like the quality of your reading is more important than the quantity, and to me the quantity is like part of the quality for quite specific reasons, but that's not the case for everyone. So anyway, today I wanted to talk like both about how I manage to read a lot and also why I read a lot, because maybe that's useful to know. I'm also wearing a very appropriate t-shirt for this video that says read more books on, but you can't see it because of the camera line, but I thought I would tell you that anyway. Anyway, let me talk about the things I actually want to talk about today. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that books are my job. Like, I work in books, I work in the world of books. So although reading is not my job and reading is not really part of my job, I do have to read a lot of books for my job. Like, it's quite important for the various career path things I have going on that I read a lot of books. So if you don't know, if you're new to this channel, I work both as an author and an editor. I write historical fiction, and I also work as a fiction editor, editing, copy editing and proofreading novels for publishers. And if you want to be a good writer and if you want to be a good editor, you have to read a lot of books, because you learn how books work by reading books. So do you feel that it is like absolutely essential for my skills as an editor and as an author to read a lot of books, and especially to read a lot of like new releases? As an editor, when I'm editing books, especially if I'm doing edits kind of more at the earlier stages in a book, if I'm doing a structural or line edit, then I am always thinking about how to make the book better just as a book, but I'm also editing like with half my mind on the market and where this book would fit in the market, and making sure that the book works in its position in the market, I suppose, if that makes sense. So reading a lot of new releases is kind of really important market research and market knowledge for me that really improves my skill as an editor, and I think also helps me as an author who wants to like have a commercially viable career writing historical fiction. So the fact that I work in books and that books are very essential to my career, and to the various like strings of my career, that definitely means that I read a lot more. I think working in publishing, both in-house and now in freelance, has increased my reading speed, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second, but it's also really opened my eyes to like the amount of books that are out there, and it's really opened my mind to the market. Like, I feel like I'm quite aware of like what new releases are coming out, what books are coming out, what books I might want to read, and that means that I feel like there are a lot of books out there that I want to read, which encourages me to read more. I've been a freelance editor for nearly 2 years now, but before then I used to work in-house. When I worked in-house, I did used to do some reading as part of my job, because I would read submissions, but now I don't really do much reading as part of my like day-to-day working life. I do edit, and obviously like if you edit a book, you have read it, but you're engaging with the book in a different way when you're doing an edit. Occasionally I do a little bit of reading for work if I'm editing a book that is part of a series and I read the last book in the series or something like that, but that's not very common. So it's not necessarily that reading is part of my job, it's not anymore, but doing reading outside of work is important to like keep me good at my job, if that makes sense. Also, as an author, I do sometimes get sent books for review, and like, it's a joy to read those books. That's not work, but like I am also quite aware that it is useful for my career to like read books by other authors and quote on them. So reading books that I get sent for review is not work, but again, it is like work adjacent. And I do always try and make like extra time if I can for books that have been sent for review as an author. I do sort of view BookTube as like part of my freelance work, to be honest. Not so much that I consider it work. Like, I love this. This has been my hobby for a very long time, long before I went freelance. But I think more because that mindset allows me to like dedicate more time to it. But BookTube does always definitely make me want to read more things. I feel like when you're part of the BookTube community, whether as a content creator or not, you're watching lots of people talk about books and you're exposed to a lot of books. And I don't know about you, but I just want to read them all. Like, I feel like so often I watch videos and I'm like, oh, I want to read that and that and that. And that always makes me feel like I want to read more books. And I feel like one of the reasons why I read a lot of books is just because there are a lot of books that I want to read. The next kind of category I wanted to talk about, or point I wanted to make, is that I am just naturally a fast reader. Everyone reads at different speeds, that's completely normal, and I read pretty quickly. I think that working in publishing has definitely increased my reading speed. I think especially when I used to work in-house and read submissions, and we would often have to get through submissions very quickly, because if you wanted to respond to a submission, and if there was a lot of buzz around it, like, you would just have to read a book very fast. And the knowledge that I always had a lot of books to read when I worked in publishing kind of got me used to reading quickly, I guess. And so I think working in publishing and reading submissions for many years, which you do a lot of when you're at like the assistant editor level, I do think that made me a faster reader. And once you're into like a fast reading habit, I guess that is kind of hard to break. I would say that I can read probably like 80 to 100 pages an hour of a contemporary novel, and maybe like 50 to 70 pages an hour of a classic. That depends a lot on the novel and a lot on the typesetting. And I will say as well that like UK typesetting tends to be quite a bit looser than US typesetting. So I feel like reading 100 pages an hour might sound mad to you if you are usually reading US editions of books, whereas some UK editions of books have a lot looser typesetting. Although having said that, typesetting has in general got a bit tighter over the last few years in the UK because of the increase in paper costs in recent years. So I do sometimes find now that I can't actually get through as many pages an hour as I have in my head that I can. Recently I was reading The Mars House by Natasha Pulley, and I timed myself and I was getting through like 25 pages an hour, which for me is very, very slow. And I think that was partly because it was quite tightly typeset, and also because it was quite dense and like a really complicated world. And I did find it like a strange experience reading that book and feeling like it was taking me a very long time to get through. So, you know, it really varies a lot from book to book. But in general, I would say I'm quite a fast reader. I do often time myself when I read. Like, I sometimes set myself a half an hour timer and think about like what page I'm on when I start and what page I'm on when I finish. I think that timing myself and seeing like how many pages I can get through in half an hour is something that probably started from reading submissions in publishing and knowing I had like limited time and seeing how far I could get through a book in that time. It's definitely something I still do as a freelance editor. You know, I set my timer for 2 hours and I see how many pages I get through in 2 hours, and that's really useful for helping me estimate how long it's going to take me to edit a novel as a whole. I don't think that timing myself makes me faster, and I don't do it all the time. I probably do it less than I used to, actually. But I do find it quite useful sometimes if I'm like 3/4 of the way through the book and I want to see whether or not I have time to like finish a book that evening. Another thing that might make me a faster reader, the other day I was watching some videos from Eleanor Nick Bater, and there were 2 videos she put up, one recently and one from 2 years ago, about aphantasia, which is when you have no visual memory and no visual imagination. I don't have aphantasia. I do have a visual memory, though it's quite like blurry and hazy, but I don't really have a visual imagination. I don't really visualize anything when I read, and even when I write, I don't really visualize anything in my mind. Like, I can't really see anything in my mind's eye unless it is a memory, and even then, like, I can't really quite grasp hold of it. So I don't necessarily think I have aphantasia, but I do think I am towards that end, and I have quite a limited visual imagination. And Eleanor was saying in her video that she thinks having aphantasia maybe makes her a faster reader because she's not kind of like stopping to build a mental picture as she reads. And I thought that was really interesting because I am a very fast reader and I have, as I said, very limited visual imagination. I do wonder if the fact that I don't have much of a visual imagination does make me a faster reader. So I don't really know if that's true and if that really makes me a faster reader, but I am interested to know if people who are slower readers do have more visual imaginations. I would be interested to know if there is a correlation there. The next thing I wanted to talk about is kind of like reading environments and reading tactics, because I do think these things probably make me a faster reader and make me read more. Whenever I put up reading vlogs, I often get a few comments saying, oh, it's really interesting that you read with your bookmark going down the lines. And that is very much how I read and how I've always read. You know, if I'm reading a book, I underline each line with my bookmark as I go, and I work down the page with my bookmark moving down the page. That's how I read, that's how I've always read. And I don't know if that makes me read faster, but I think it's possible that it does. I realised after I got glasses in my early 20s that the reason why I had always read like that is because I have astigmatism, which means that my eyes find it hard to focus on things. My glasses now do like correct that, but I definitely remember as a teenager and as a child like trying to read and the lines blurring together. You know, I'd be reading a line and I'd end up reading like the first half of one line, and then my eyes would skip to like the second half of the line below. And so I guess I started using a bookmark to go down the lines to avoid that. It feels really natural and very helpful for me to read with my bookmark going down the lines, and I do wonder if it makes my reading faster. Whenever I read a book physically, I'm always using my bookmark, underlining every line. I used to do that on my Kindle, but these days Kindles are all touchscreen, so I can't really use a bookmark, but I do have my font set to a pretty large size, which I think kind of helps in a similar way. And then another thing that I do find quite useful is that I have a reading light. I have a Serious light made from Serious Readers. They kindly sent me one for review like 2 years ago now, and they've done a couple of sponsored videos with me. This video is not sponsored, I just genuinely like the light, so I talk about it a lot. But I do find that having like a good reading light or reading in a well-lighted room does mean that I read faster. Like I do notice that I find it harder to read for a longer period of time, or find it harder to read as fast if I'm reading without a good light source. And actually, I feel like I used to do a lot of my reading out and about and on trains, which we'll talk about in a minute, whereas now that I'm freelance and work from home, I do a lot more reading like in one place with the same light. Now I do a lot of my reading like in one place in this room using that reading light, and I do think that helps me read faster. Another way that I manage to read a lot of books is by using a variety of formats, or I say a variety, but really I just mean I read a lot physically and I also read a lot on audiobook. I do sometimes read books on ebook, but in general if I can access the book not on ebook, then that's my preference, partly I think because I can use the bookmark to go down the lines. But I read a lot physically, but I also listen to a lot on audiobook, and I do think that audiobooks help me read a lot more than I would if I wasn't listening to any audiobooks. I would say that audiobooks probably make up like a quarter to a third of my reading in terms of the quantity of books I read on audiobook, but because listening to an audiobook is a slower process than reading a book physically, I probably spend as much time listening to audiobooks as I do reading physically, or nearly as much, I would say. I also spend a lot of time listening to BookTube, and like the balance between BookTube and audiobooks and kind of when I listen to one and listen to the other sort of varies week by week, but there are quite a lot of times when I'm listening to audiobooks. I don't in general sit down and listen to an audiobook if I have time to like sit down. I would rather kind of sit down and read physically, but I listen to audiobooks when I exercise, and I have a knee injury and I have to do like quite a lot of physio exercises, so I do like at least 45 minutes of exercise every other day. I often listen to audiobooks or BookTube while cooking. I always listen to audiobooks rather than reading physically if I have a bus journey to go on because I get travel sick. I also listen to audiobooks when I'm driving. They're usually only rereads. I also listen to audiobooks while I'm like cleaning or doing any housework. You know, if I'm going to the supermarket, then I put my headphones in, put my audiobook on, walk to the supermarket, do all my shopping with my headphones in, and just like take my headphones out when I get to the counter. You know, I usually write myself a shopping list while I'm not listening to an audiobook before I go out, so I don't really need to think about anything when I'm shopping. I also listen to audiobooks while I'm playing video games, by which I mean there is one game that I really like called Don't Starve, which isn't very like brain intensive, so I often play that game while listening to an audiobook. My husband Nick and I also listen to audiobooks together sometimes, you know, maybe if we're just eating dinner or if we're traveling or going on holiday together or anything like that. So I do end up spending a lot of time listening to audiobooks. I would say that I also usually listen to an audiobook on like 1.2, 1.25 speed, so I'm also kind of getting through an audiobook slightly faster than you might otherwise. And I do think that listening to audiobooks just helps me read a lot more. Another reason why I think I read a lot is that I read across quite quite a lot of different genres. I think this is definitely more of a like why I read a lot rather than how I read a lot. I guess reading over a variety of genres maybe does help you avoid like reading slumps or anything like that, but to be honest, I think it's more just that because I like a lot of different kinds of books, there are therefore a lot of different kinds of books that I want to read. You know, I really love classics and I read quite a lot of classics. I really enjoy reading books from the past because I love history, and especially 19th century British history and literature is something I'm really passionate about, I'm really, really interested in. But I also love modern books, and I especially love historical fiction that's being published today. And so if I want to both like keep up with new releases and the market of historical fiction now and read a lot of classics and read lots of other bits and pieces, you know, I like plays and short stories and poetry, I like the occasional bit of sci-fi and fantasy, I like the occasional romance or rom-com, I like bits of literary fiction and some kind of like general reading group fiction. Like there are so many different kinds of books that I want to read, and so if I want to read a bit of all those different kinds of books, then I do have to read a lot of books, otherwise I just wouldn't manage to get to everything I wanted to read. Another thing that kind of leads on from that is that I read lots of books of very varied lengths. You know, often I'll do my monthly wrap up and yes, maybe I've read 12 to 14 books that month, but if one of them was a play and one of them was a poetry collection and one of them was a short story collection, all of which were like under 200 or under 100 pages, then that is very different from having read 14 400-page novels. I enjoy both long and short books, and although I often read lots of stuff of middle length, I do also read quite a lot of very short things. I do also read some very long things, and I actually really enjoy reading very long things on audiobook because I feel like it's not taking time away from my other reading in the same way. Somehow that just works well for me. So I think reading things that are a mix of lengths does help me read more, but also the fact I read quite a lot of short things as well probably does mean that it looks statistically like I read more than I actually do. Like I would be interested to know what my average page length was for the books that I read in 2023. On the one hand, I did read quite a lot of very long, like 1,000-page Dickens mammoths, but I did also read like a lot of plays and poetry and short stories, so I don't know.
Editing Katie from the future, I found out where on Goodreads I can see my book stats versus my page stats, and as you can see, according to my book stats, I read nearly as much in 2023 as I did in 2020, and I read a lot in 2022 and 2021 as well. But if I go to my page stats, you will see that that changes quite a lot. I read a lot more pages in 2020 than I did in 2023, which I do think is because I have become more interested in reading plays, poetry and short story collections over the last few years. So I've read shorter things. I do think it probably does look like I read a lot more than I do when I look at my stats, because I do read quite a lot of short things.
Another thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this video is sort of whether to read one book at a time or multiple books at once. I feel like when I made a version of this video back in 2019, I said that I often read multiple books at a time and that helped me read more. And I feel like my reading habits when it comes to reading multiple books at a time have slightly changed. So in general, I am reading multiple books at a time in that I usually have an audiobook and a physical book on the go, but I usually only have two main books on the go, one that I'm listening to and one that I'm reading physically. I do occasionally have like a second audiobook that I'm listening to with my husband Nick, or a non-fiction book that I'm reading very slowly in little bits. So for example, I am sort of currently reading London Laboured and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, but that book is a work of non-fiction kind of split up into articles, and I'm just reading like an article here and there. I am sort of currently reading it, but I'm not like actively currently reading it, if that makes sense. I feel like I used to read multiple books at once. Like I often used to have a classic and a contemporary physically on the go and an audiobook as well. But now I feel like that doesn't really work for me as well as it used to. And now I tend to find that like one book at a time is much better for me. Often if I end up reading two books at a time, then one of them just gets neglected, which is what has happened with Varney the Vampire, which I started a few months ago and I read like 150, 200 pages of. And then because it's really long, I was going to read it like alongside other things, but I always end up just prioritizing the other current book. So I need to like get back properly into Varney the Vampire and just like read it all in one go, massive though it is, because I think actually just trying to read multiple books at once doesn't really work for me unless they're in two separate formats. Another thing that I think has changed for me quite a lot over the last few years is my reading routine. I guess when it comes to reading, there are sort of like two different ways that you can fit reading into your life. One is that you kind of like fit it in around everything else, and one is that you like set aside dedicated time to read. And I feel like back in 2019, when I made another video about how I read a lot, I was very much someone who was fitting reading into my day-to-day life. I was reading pretty much every day, and at that point I was going into an office every day for work, so I had an hour commute into work and an hour commute back from work, so that was 2 hours of reading I had every day. That was 2 hours where I wasn't doing anything else, and that was like the main time I spent reading. But obviously that kind of changed in 2020 with lockdown anyway, and then I went freelance back in 2022, and since then I have been working from home, so I don't have a commute anymore, which definitely has changed my reading habits quite a lot. I would say that I do still like always have a book in my bag and always take a book with me. You know, if I go to the doctor's, I take my book out and read while I'm waiting to be seen. If I'm going into the centre of town to see friends, then I take a book and read on the train. So I do still get reading done like on transport and moving around, but it's definitely not the same as like the 2 hours reading every day that I used to get on my commute. So I feel like my reading used to be very, very like steady, set amount every day, whereas now my reading is like very up and down and very, very scattered. As a freelancer, my work load changes like week by week, so if I have a quieter week then I can give more time to reading, and if I have a busier week then I don't. I think I also mentioned a while back when I was talking about freelancing that the kind of freelance work I'm doing also affects how much I read. If you have been proofreading or copy editing all day, it is quite hard to sit down and read for pleasure at the end of that day, because you will spot errors in every book you read. Whereas if you've been doing a structural edit or a line edit, which are more like qualitative and less about like grammar and punctuation and errors, then it's much easier to sit down and read for pleasure at the end of the day. So I do feel like how much I read depends on the work I'm doing and how busy I am. And I feel like I used to read, you know, just reliably 2 or 3 books a week. Whereas now, like, I'm filming this on the 9th of May. I have finished 1 book so far this month. We'll see how many books I've read by the end of May, but I just think I've had a slow start, and I will read more books in the second half of the month. I feel like my reading is now much more up and down and much more inconsistent than it used to be. Quite a lot of advice for reading more often revolves around like reading every day, but I definitely don't read every day. Well, I definitely don't read physically every day. It probably is rare that a day goes by when I don't listen to an audiobook at all or read physically, because as I said, I'm doing like physio exercises every other day, so every other day I'm definitely listening to an audiobook, and I often listen to audiobooks while I'm cooking and like hanging up washing and stuff. So I do probably listen to a bit of an audiobook every day, but I definitely don't read physically every day. I would say that I now do like less bit by bit reading and more like binge reading. And actually one of the reasons why I feel like I've read a lot in recent years is because I've started doing these like reading days every now and then. I try and do a few a year where I just set aside a day that is just for reading, and I spend like 12 hours reading. I think I did this first back in 2020 and I just really enjoyed doing it, and so I try to do it now quite a few times a year. And you know, it's a luxury to be able to do that. You know, I'm freelance and sometimes I can bunch 5 days of work into 4 days and take 1 day just to read. And I've been very lucky to be sponsored for a couple of reading vlogs on this channel by serious readers, which I'm very grateful for. I also often find that I read a lot on holiday, and that if I take time off work, then that is often time that I'm doing a lot of reading. Not always, but often. In April I read 17 books, and I think 10 or 11 of them were books that I read on holiday, and actually 11 books is quite a big chunk of your yearly reading, and I read them all, you know, on one holiday, so that definitely impacts how much I read over the course of a year. Another reason why I read a lot, I think, is to do with my like attitude toward my TBR. I think I've spoken about this before on my channel, but I feel like different people have different attitudes to the books they own which are unread. For some people that is their personal library, and they're just like going to it every now and then to pick out a book that sounds interesting and read it. And for some people it is a to-do list, and my physical TBR is definitely a to-do list, and I don't like a to-do list that is too long. So I do feel like part of the reason why I read a lot is because I want to read the books that are on my physical TBR, and because I want to like get to the end of my to-do list. That is not a sad way for me to think about it. I love to-do lists. I really enjoy like spreadsheets and to-do lists and time management and lists. All of that stuff is like enjoyable and relaxing for me. Like, it doesn't feel stressful, it feels like taking control. So I really enjoy that my TBR feels like a to-do list, but I do feel like the fact that I'm like, this is a to-do list and I must get to the end of it one day, I do feel like that encourages me to read more, or makes me feel the need to read more, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't know. I feel like this is all very like personal mindset stuff, but that does, I think, definitely affect the way and the amount I read. Talking of to-do lists, sometimes I put read on my daily to-do list to remind myself to read, almost like it's like the final task of my work day. I must do some reading at the end once I've done all the other stuff. And I find that quite a nice thing because that encourages me to dedicate time in a day to reading. And I also usually, like, I don't necessarily put that on my to-do list every day, but I'll have a look at my like workload day by day and be like, oh, that day I'm less busy, I have less other tasks to do, so I'll put down an hour of reading like at the end of my to-do list, and I'll do that when I finish my other work, and I'll do that when I finish my work, and that'll be something that I will tick off my to-do list at the end of the day. And then the final reason why I think I end up reading a lot of books is because reading is my main like form of relaxation, and it's my main hobby. I sort of have other hobbies, but all my hobbies are really book related, and really my other two book-related hobbies apart from reading are writing and booktube, and writing has kind of now become part of my work now that I'm a published author, which is kind of surreal because I spent so many years of my life with writing being like my #1 hobby, and now it's like part of my work, which is really lovely, but also means that usually if I want to spend more time writing, then I'm like dedicating more of my work time to it rather than more of my free time, if that makes sense. And booktube as well, I have kind of slightly folded into my freelance day, I guess. And also, like, in order to support booktube as my hobby, I also need to read a lot of other books as well. Like, those two hobbies very much go hand in hand. And, you know, beyond the time I spend writing and doing freelance editing and doing booktube, the main thing I spend my time on is reading. Like, if I'm on my own and I'm relaxing, then the thing that I'm doing is reading. I really enjoy watching TV and film with my husband or with friends, but it's not really something I ever do on my own. And I think because reading is like my main hobby and I don't really have like that many other interests, then that does mean that I read a lot. And that's just personal to me because books are my primary interest. I think a lot of people have a lot more like variation in their hobbies, but me, really, it's all just books and book related things, which, you know, is absolutely fine because that's what I love. So there we go. This has been a bit of a rambly discussion about how and why I read a lot of books. I hope this has been interesting and informative in some way. I don't think it's necessarily been that useful if you're someone who wants to read more, because I do think, as I said, a lot of these things are just kind of very personal to me and my personality, or the fact that I work freelance. But I do love reading, and for me, the quantity of books that I read is part of the quality of my reading, because I really like reading a lot of varied things from a lot of different genres and a lot of different time periods and countries. And if you want to read a really big mix of things, then you kind of do have to read a lot, and that's something that I really, really enjoy. There are just a lot of books out there that I want to read, and I know I can't read them all, but I would like to read a lot of them. So that's all for now. Do leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and if you don't have anything specific to say, then maybe leave like the open book emoji. I feel like that is the best emoji for reading. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.